How the Falcons offense performs over the next 6 games not only sets the stage for a potential playoff push, but also the long-term outlook of the Raheem Morris era.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel, where you can start the season with a big return. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. So if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I appreciate each and every one of you that go strong with me as everydayers. That means you make this podcast your first listen or first watch each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. So, guys, today's episode is all about the Falcons offense. Tomorrow we'll be focusing on the defense, but a lot of today's episode is going to be looking ahead to the offseason for this offseason and some of the potential changes on the Falcons offense, as well as some of the limitations in terms of their inability to make wholesale changes on this offense because they don't necessarily have the assets to do so. But it is the bye week. We don't have to necessarily look back at a recent game or look forward to the next game at this point in time. And so we will sort of, plant our flag and sort of look ahead to these next 6 weeks. But, let's talk about the last 12 weeks of the season and the next 6 weeks coming up for the season for this Falcons offense. And sort of revisiting the last 12 weeks, we talked about this all in the offseason leading up to the season that, the bet that the Falcons were really making under Raheem Morris in year one of his coaching staff was really a bet on Zach Robinson, that he was going to be able to come in, integrate the new pieces like Kirk Cousins, like Darnell Mooney, Ray-Ray McCloud, Charlie Warner, with the inherited pieces that he had from the Arthur Smith regime, Bijan Robinson, Drake London, Kyle Pitts, the same starting 5 offensive line, and meld that into one of the better offenses in the NFL. And for the most part, Zach Robinson has accomplished that. Right. Look at, I think DVOA, they went into this weekend ranked 11th or 12th. I think they're like 12th in EPA per play. So that's about where we thought, or at least I thought, this offense would be this season, somewhere in that 10 to 15 range. Right. And there's potential for them to be even better than that, depending on how they play over these next 6 weeks. But, you go back to that week 1 game. Like we went into the season thinking like, yeah, their floor offensively is maybe like the 18th best offense in the NFL, and their ceiling is, potentially a top 5 offense or something like that. And then we got that week 1 performance where it was like, maybe the floor is the 28th best offense. That's part of the reason why we had such a visceral reaction, negative reaction to that opening season loss to the Pittsburgh Steelers. But since then, Zach Robinson has done a good job and has lived up to expectations, but we want to see if he can do more. And especially over these next 6 weeks, because the final word on Zach Robinson and this bet that the Falcons have made, as well as, what this season is going to be, hinges so heavily on this offense. And we've talked about that a number of times in recent days and weeks on this podcast, that it's really, this team is built to win games 28-24, not necessarily built to win games 17-16. And so you need your offense scoring points in order to win those types of ball games. And, these next 6 games are going to determine, whether or not this Falcon team makes the playoffs. And it's going to determine a lot about sort of the overall outlook for not only Zach Robinson in this offense, but the Raheem Morris regime in the long term. Because, again, we'll talk more about this in terms of the defense tomorrow. But, for the foreseeable future, the Falcons are going to be carried by their offense, right? And so how great you feel about their ability to be carried by that offense, a lot is going to be determined by how they finish this season strong. So the story so far for the Falcons, though, has been, and we'll see how they perform over these next 6 games. But the story so far has been that this offense has generally looked good against bad defenses and looked pretty bad against good defenses, right? That if you look at, they've played 5 games against defenses that are currently ranked in the top 15 according to DVOA. The Falcons are 1-4 in those 5 games. They average less than 14 points a game in those 5 games, which would be dead last in the NFL by a significant margin. And they're averaging about 303 yards per game, which would be about 25th best in the NFL in those 5 games. And so essentially against quality defenses, this is a bottom 10 offense. Now you contrast that with how they perform against, teams that are in the bottom 15 in terms of DVOA rankings. They've had 6 of those games. They're 5-1 in those games. They average about 29 points per game in those 6 games. That's third best in the NFL, or that would be third best in the NFL. And they average about 410 yards per game, which would be about second best in the NFL. So essentially, they're a top 3 offense when they face a bad defense. Now, fortunately for the Falcons, they have 4 games remaining this season against below average defenses. They have their next 2 against the Chargers at home next week, and then on the road against the Minnesota Vikings against good defenses, where I think the Vikings are considered the best defense according to DVOA, and the Chargers, I think, are 10th best at this current rank. And so, will we see that narrative shift? Will we see the Falcons offense step up against quality defenses over the next 2 weeks? And will we see them continue to maintain their success against lesser quality defenses over the remaining 4 weeks? That will be an interesting conversation to sort of see. But, it's important that the Falcons offense performs because, again, as I said, this team is built to their defense is not good enough for them to trust in their ability to win game 17-14. And so this offense is going to have to put up, 27, 28, 30 or more points on a more consistent basis than they've shown so far this year in order to win these games because, the Bucs are nipping on the heels. They just blew out the Giants on Sunday. They're now 5-6. They're 2 games behind the Falcons. Now, if the Falcons go 4-2 and finish the season with 10 wins, the only way the Bucs can catch them in terms of the playoff race is by running the table, right? They'd have to win out the rest of the season. The Bucs have to be 1 win better than the Falcons because of the tiebreaker, because the Falcons swept them. So they would have to win 11 games, which is their best possible outcome for the Bucs, and the Falcons would only have to win 10 games. Now it's possible that the Bucs could do that, but we'll see. But you like the Falcons' odds a little bit better if they win 4 or 5 of the next, if they win 5 games, they're pretty much clinching the division. But we'll see if the Falcons, and again, like to me, if the Falcons are going to win 4 or 5 of their next 6 games, it's going to be because the offense is performing. And we'll see if this offense looks like the well-oiled machine that we expect them to be, right? They've had 12 weeks to work out the kinks. They've had a bye week to tweak it and adjust it. And this offense should be firing mostly on all cylinders. Drew Dalman's coming back after the bye, so they should be healthy on their offensive line, or relatively healthy on their offensive line. Right? You should have all your skill position players. We'll see what the status of Darnell Mooney, who's dealing with a hamstring injury last week. That has a tendency to nag moving forward. But for many reasons, you should be expecting this offense to be able to sort of lift the floor, carry this offense, carry this football team for the next 6 weeks, and whether or not they do that is going to, again, have so much impact on their team, not only in the short term, but also the long term. And we'll get into more of those long-term conversations as today's episode continues. And we'll start looking ahead to the offseason and getting into some of the conversations that we're going to be having about this offense and some of the potential changes that we could be seeing on this offseason. And basically, we're going to have these conversations regardless of what happens over the next 6 weeks, but how loud those conversations are going to be in terms will be determined by what happens over the next 6 games, and we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Time is a precious commodity, and so often, guys, I feel like I'm wasting far too much of it scrolling mindlessly on my phone, and I often think, man, I could be spending this time more wisely looking for ways to improve myself. And thankfully, our sponsor, Hillsdale College, has an offer that will help you and I improve ourselves because they have more than 40 free, that's right, free online courses on history, politics, economics, philosophy, chemistry, and mathematics. All their courses are self-paced, so you can start whenever. Plus, you can go deeper with the readings, the quizzes, the lectures, and the discussions if you want. However you want to spend your time at Hillsdale, you can do so. And so if you want to take advantage of this opportunity to, make yourself a little bit smarter, go right now to hillsdale.edu/lockedon to enroll. There's no cost and it's easy to get started. That's hillsdale.edu/lockedon to register. Hillsdale.edu/lockedon. And guys, I want to tell you about Prize Picks, America's #1 daily fantasy sports app, because they have over 10 million active members, because it's the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Unlike other apps on PrizePicks, it's just you against the numbers. Pick more or less on at least 2 player stat projections and watch the winnings roll in. And now you can win up to 100 times your money on your entry with as little as 4 correct picks. And especially if you're looking to get in on the action, because certain sports books aren't available in your state like Georgia or California, don't worry, PrizePicks is. Withdrawals are fast, safe, and secure, and you can get your money in as quick as 15 minutes. So check it out by downloading the PrizePicks app today. Use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly when you play $5. PrizePicks, run your game. So when we talk about the offseason conversations when it comes to the Falcons offense, there's really 3 conversations that we're going to be having in terms of, making changes this offseason. It's going to be the quarterback along the tight end position in the offensive line. Now, you can argue there's a 4th conversation that may or may not be had depending on how these next 6 games go. And that will depend, that will be involving Zach Robinson, the Falcons offensive coordinator's, potential to get hired away as a head coach of another team, right? We can guess this offseason that Ben Johnson, the Lions offensive coordinator, is going to continue to be the sort of the top option for a team looking for an offensive-minded head coach. But given last year's shenanigan, we'll see if he leaves Detroit or whatever. But I think depending on how these next 6 games go, you can make a case that Zach Robinson has an opportunity to sort of be the number 2 guy on that list. And depending on how many openings we get, it seems very likely that we'll get at least 3. Maybe we get up to 8. I don't know. But obviously, the more openings we have, the higher the probability that someone will potentially be able to lure Zach Robinson away. But we'll see how that all plays out. So that will be a conversation that we'll have that first week of January after Black Monday and all that sort of stuff that we can really have in earnest. But, Zach Robinson can certainly help his stock if this offense is firing all cylinders and looking like that well-oiled machine over these next 6 games. But getting back to the 3 main conversations that we're going to be having, that's the 4th conversation. The 3 main conversations are going to be about the quarterback position, the tight end position, the offensive line. We're not going to really have a conversation about the running back position. The Falcons are pretty good there. Wide receiver is maybe a worthwhile conversation, but because, Drake London, Darnell Mooney, Ray McLeod have all arguably exceeded expectations this year, I don't think the Falcons are going to prioritize that position. We'll talk later about some of the limited assets that they have to make upgrades this offseason, and that's part of that conversation. And there's certainly room for improvement at the wide receiver position. The Falcons could certainly have a better trio and threesome of wide receivers than what they currently have. But given some of the other issues, and again, we'll get into more of that tomorrow when we talk about the defense, as well as some of the topics that we're going to discuss today, I suspect at this point in time that we'll see that wide receiver position be at the bottom of the totem pole. But again, these next 6 games could, impact that, especially if this offense really struggles. Like, hypothetically, let's say Darnell Mooney misses like 3 games and this offense really struggles without Darnell Mooney, then you're like, okay, well, maybe we need to add another body there. But, really it's the quarterback, is the tight end, is the offensive line. And all these conversations are going to be had this offseason, guys. It's just going to be how loud these conversations are going to be is dependent on what happens over the next 6 games, right? The quarterback conversation is basically going to be, do they make the switch to Michael Penix? That conversation is going to be had by somebody this offseason, right? The simps, the Penix pumpers, as the extremists, as I often call them, they're going to have that. Kirk Cousins could lead this team to run the table and win the Super Bowl this year. And there's still going to be people that following Monday being like, yeah, Kirk played great, MVP, all that stuff, but it's Penix's turn. Like, that conversation is inevitable, right? That's just the Pandora's box that this regime opened up by, drafting Michael Penix and whatnot. That conversation is going to be inevitable. It's just a question of how loud that conversation is. And a lot of that depends on how Kirk Cousins plays down the stretch. The worse Kirk plays, the worse this offense performs, the louder that conversation is going to be. And regardless of whether, Kirk is directly responsible for the offensive struggles, right? We know the quarterback gets all the credit when the team succeeds, and then they win. And they get all the blame when the team fails or when they lose. And so that's just the nature of the beast. So even if Kirk plays well, he's going to get blamed, even if, they're out here losing games 41-38 and he's throwing 4 touchdowns a game or whatever. He's still going to get blamed for that. Oh man, well, Michael Penix would have won that game 45-41. So that's always going to be a conversation. But, that the loudness of that conversation is going to depend on these next 6 games. And we'll see. We'll see on that front. Again, I think it's very likely at this point in time that Kirk will be back next year as a starting quarterback for the Falcons. But certainly that black cloud, so to speak, could be hanging over this entire offseason, where a lot of people are like, we should trade Kirk and we should do all this stuff. And again, that may be a more relevant conversation when we get later in the episode talking about the limited assets. And, you could make an argument again that, the Falcons could use, some assets in the trade. But speaking of trade assets, that's where the tight end conversation comes from, because it's like, do they really love Kyle Pitts enough to retain Kyle Pitts? There's going to be a conversation this offseason about, should the Falcons trade Kyle Pitts? Because if this offense, this coaching staff is not committed to making Kyle Pitts a featured part of this offense, you can make a case that, again, given some of their limited assets that they're going to have and the desire to get more assets, that in the draft, that trading Kyle Pitts for a premium early round pick makes a ton of sense this offseason if they're not committed to making him a featured part of his offense. And it's been hot and cold. It's been off and on with Kyle Pitts, right? They've said all the right things, but their actions don't really suggest that they love Kyle Pitts in this offense, because he's too often an afterthought in this offense, right? And we'll see if he continues to be an afterthought in this offense over these next 6 games, or can we get sort of what we saw from Kyle Pitts in October in December, right? September Kyle Pitts, November Kyle Pitts has been okay, but like not a difference maker, not any better than probably your average starting NFL tight end, right? And so the Falcons could easily justify, well, we can do, we can save some money, we can get a draft pick and lose very little based off of how they use that position. So unless this team is very committed to Kyle Pitts, again, that's going to be a conversation this offseason. Again, how loud that conversation is, depending on how Kyle Pitts and this offense performs down the stretch, we could be like, oh yeah, trading Kyle Pitts doesn't make a ton of sense. Like, sure, you could do that, but why would you do that, given that he had, 4 touchdowns in the last 6 games and average whatever catches and yards or whatnot, and was a pivotal part of this offense's success down the stretch? Or he continues to be an afterthought, as he has been at various times this season. You're like, yeah, that's not a critical component of this offense. It's really a wide receiver centric offense. And, you can just get any mid-tier tight end and it'll be fine. So that conversation will be had. The last conversation is going to be about the offensive line, right? And that conversation is going to center on, what do you do with Drew Dalman this offseason? As I said earlier, Drew Dalman's going to should be back and starting these last 6 games. How he performs over these next 6 games will probably have a big factor in whether or not the Falcons are going to re-sign him as a free agent next year. But that's a big conversation, because if you commit, a multi-year contract to Drew Dalman, as you would assume the Falcons would, if they do resign him, that's committing to a certain style of offense. That's committing to, the outside zone run scheme. And the reason why that's pertinent, if you haven't been paying attention to the rest of the NFL this weekend, the Sunday night game between the Rams and Eagles features Sean McVay versus Vic Fangio. And if you don't know the history behind that matchup, they haven't faced each other since 2018, right? A Sean McVay-led offense versus a Vic Fangio-led defense since 2018. And in that 2018 game, Vic Fangio unveiled a 6-1 defense that utterly shut down that Rams offense that Bill Belichick then copied in the Super Bowl to shut down the Rams offense in that Super Bowl. And basically ever since then, over the last 5 years, Sean McVay has done everything in his power to pivot away from that style of offense, that outside zone heavy offense under Todd Gurley and with Jared Goff with the play action and all that stuff, and being much more of a, shotgun, Matthew Stafford, we're going to run it downhill, Kyron Williams, gap duo run scheme. Basically, Vic Fangio put the fear of God in Sean McVay. And you've seen a lot of other offenses, 49ers being another one under Kyle Shanahan, move away from the outside zone scheme for a lot of similar reasons. Meanwhile, the Falcons are very committed to the outside zone scheme, right? And if you sign Drew Dalman, you're going to remain committed to the outside zone scheme. Now, there is a conversation to be had that you can still diversify your run scheme and do kind of some of the things that the Falcons did, I recall, in 2014 under Mike Tice and Wade Harmon, the offensive line coaches back then, and using a lot of taking advantage of the athleticism of your offensive line by incorporating more pulling plays rather than just relying on zone runs and whatnot, as this team currently does. There's a conversation to be had, but we'll talk about that later if need be. But if you want to follow the suit of the rest of the NFL, basically, right? It seems like the smarter OCs, the Sean McVays, the Kyle Shanahan's, no offense to Zach Robinson, but he hasn't shown he's on that level yet. If these guys have basically figured out you can't just be married to this one run scheme long-term, because other NFL teams are going to be able to shut you down. And so you want to be able to, if you're the Falcons, you want to have that flexibility to be able to diversify your run game. Do you commit to Drew Dalman? this offseason for that reason. Do you get a center in here that, isn't so outside zone centric in the ways that Drew Dalman is? Maybe, right? So that is going to be a conversation this offseason, right? Do the Falcons bring back Drew Dalman, and what does that mean for the future of their run scheme, which is an important element of their offense in the future? So we'll see. We'll see how Dalman performs. We'll see what this run scheme does. Maybe Zach Robinson starts to diversify things a little bit away from, 60% outside zone, 30% inside zone, and then 10% other, after the bye week. Maybe that's one of the tweaks they go through. So again, that's a conversation worth having probably this all season, but we'll see how loud that conversation is. Is it time to move on for Drew Dalman so that we don't get stuck in a situation similar to Sean McVay was, 5-6 years ago, and being like, oh no, this isn't working anymore because defenses have figured us out? Or do you want to be ahead of the curve? Do you want to be proactive as opposed to reactive? So that is going to be a conversation that we're going to have this offseason. But let's wrap up today's episode talking about, some of the limitations the Falcons may have making wholesale changes on their offense this offseason because they have limited draft assets. They have limited cap space. And we'll break that down, guys, as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So get ready to tackle the NFL action this year with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets all in one place. So when you get that hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view the live play-by-play, and so much more on the very same page where you place your bets. So whether you want to go check out FanDuel to look at next week's line between the Falcons and Chargers, all you got to do is go to FanDuel.com. And again, you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet over at FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. So as I mentioned, the Falcons have limited assets to make changes to their offense this offseason. They have limited assets to make changes to their entire roster this offseason, right? They have limited draft picks. They have 6 draft picks as of today. They have a first-round pick, a second-round pick, a fourth-round pick, and 3 sevenths. Right, they got 2 of those 7s back in trades with Van Jefferson and Kentavious Street last year. They got a conditional, I think 7th, as part of the Taylor Heineke trade this summer. So they have 6 assets, but you really have 2 premium picks and a mid-round pick at this point in time, and that basically means unless the Falcons can acquire more draft picks somehow, some way, trading veteran players or whatnot, it doesn't look like they're going to get any comp picks this offseason. They're going to have limited opportunities in draft to make changes, right? It's basically like 2 spots at first and second round pick to get potential plug and play starters if they need them, and that's it. And then you throw on top of that the Falcons' limited cap space, right? They'll make some cuts, probably more on the defensive side of the ball than on the offensive side of the ball, right? But they're not going to necessarily gut their roster, right? In part due to the pressure from ownership to win games, right? We had this conversation back in February. Why did they fire Arthur Smith? Because he didn't make the playoffs. And it would be a tough sell to go to Arthur Blank this offseason and be like, hey, we need to completely revamp this entire roster because we're not ready to win right now. And I don't know if Arthur Blank's going to buy that, right? Someone's head's going to roll for that. And so, if you're in that building, it's not in your best interest to try to push that narrative towards your boss and be like, yeah, we need to completely revamp this team. No, you got to make it work with the bulk of this roster. So we'll see. But, I think you probably won't see too many cuts or changes on the offensive side of the ball. Again, the 3 biggest changes you may see is no Kirk Cousins, no Kyle Pitts, no Drew Dalman in all likelihood next year. And I think if we're betting, all 3 of those players are very likely to be back. But again, these next 6 games could, be important factors into determining that conversation. But you don't have a ton of cap space. You'll probably see the Falcons restructure some deals and whatnot. But you're going to see a lot of continuity on this offense in all likelihood next year, assuming that this offense doesn't completely crap the bed over the next 6 games, right? For instance, one player that I know a lot of people are wondering if the Falcons are going to cut is someone like Caleb McGary, right? In part due to, his struggles this year, playing on one leg. Those issues could get exacerbated over these next 6 games with some of the competition that they're going to be facing. Brian Burns, Max Crosby, Joey Bosa, Jonathan Grenard, et cetera. Some very good edge rushers over these next couple of weeks that could, cause Caleb McGary's, struggles to continue this year playing on one leg. But I do think he'll get the injury excuse because of the knee injury, which is clearly affecting him in a negative way. But the expectation that, we're going to replace Caleb McGary because we need to get Michael Penix's, blindside protector at that right tackle spot. And it's like, you're probably not cutting Caleb McGary. Now, you may draft the future right tackle this offseason. That's definitely on the table. But the likelihood of you drafting that guy and cutting Caleb McGary, because if you're gonna go for a plug and play right tackle, like that's a first round pick, guys. Like the chances of you finding that guy after round 1 is very low. And we all, of course, know, and we'll talk more about it tomorrow, like the expectation is that you're going to finally use that first round pick on a defensive player, not another offensive player. Okay. There's going to be a lot of pressure on this team to draft a defensive player because, again, you're not really moving the needle with these day 2 picks, and these mid-round picks on defense have not really solved your problems so far this year. So there's going to be a lot of pressure to use that number 1 pick on a defensive player. And so really the best case scenario for you to find a rookie that can come in and replace Caleb McGary, if you do choose to cut him, is in the second round. And all you have to do is do like 5 minutes of research and know that the hit rate on plug and play starters as rookies after round 1 is not very good over the last 5 years. Okay. And so that's not a great bet. And then you look at free agency, it's like, okay, well, the going rate for a premium right tackle in the NFL that you can sit there and sign and say is comfortably better than Caleb McGary is like 17, 18, 19, $20 million a year. Who are you going to pay that? Mekhi Becton? Cam Robinson? You're going to feel good about those signings. So I think there's going to be, a conversation among Falcon fans about, replacing Caleb McGary this offseason, cutting him and saving that money. But I don't think that's a realistic conversation at this point in time. But we'll see, again, what happens over the next 6 weeks. But all that to say, like, you're going to get a lot of continuity this offseason, right? You're more than likely, again, the betting favorites, and we'll see if this conversation changes over the next 6 weeks. But the betting favorites is you're going to probably run it back with the same 12 to 13 starters if you want to throw in Tyler Algier as a starter and Charlie Warner as a starter to be that number 12 and number 13 guy. Those 12 to 13 guys are going to come back next year. And how good you feel about maintaining that continuity, again, goes back to how well this offense performs. Those 12 to 13 players perform over the next 6 games. If they perform well and this offense is cooking, you're going to feel great. There's a lot of reason for people to be optimistic about where this offense is going to be and that they can build off of this season, regardless of how they finish this year, into year 2 of Zach Robinson and Kirk Cousins. Some of Kirk's best years are arguably his best years. The handful of times he's gotten a second year with the same play caller, right? That's only happened like 3 times in his NFL career because he's had Zach Robinson is basically like the 8th offensive coordinator that he's had in 10 years as a starter in the NFL. But arguably Kirk's like arguably 3 out of his 4 best seasons, you can make the case, have come with year 2 of the same play call. And so there's a lot of reason to think that Kirk, can be even better next year. And this, entire offense can be better in year 2 with everybody sort of being on the same page, not figuring it out as we have seen over the last 12 weeks, but have already figured it out and can build off of whatever success they have this year. So we will see on that front. But like, there's a lot of reason to be optimistic about maintaining continuity on this offense because, as I said earlier, like the foreseeable future, this team is going to be carried by their offense. The offense is going to be the strength of this football team, not too different to the Matt Ryan years, the bulk of the Matt Ryan era, where it was the offense that was carrying this football team. And maintaining that continuity is going to be important. And again, how good you feel about it. That's why I said at the top of this episode, how good you feel about the Raheem Morris era is going to depend on these next 6 games, because you can feel either really great about the offense's ability to carry this team for the next 3 years, right? As we rebuild the defense, more on that tomorrow's episode. Or you can feel kind of lukewarm about it because these next 6 games don't go the way you want it because you're like, Kirk didn't finish the season strong and Zach Robinson didn't really show up against, good defenses, and they continue to shut down his team and they tend to, be front runners, all that sort of conversation. The offensive line didn't make the strides and some of the skill players didn't finish as strong as you wanted them to do and all that stuff. And it just kind of muddies the waters a little bit. And you start wondering, Raheem came in saying we're not going to pick at a certain point in the draft and make the playoffs. And, all these conversations start coming up and all these second guessing starts to be had about hiring the head coach and signing the quarterback and drafting the quarterback, all these conversations that, we were like, we're not going to have these conversations this offseason. We'll let it play out. And if it doesn't play out the way that we want it to play out with this Falcons offense humming, finishing the season strong, winning football games, making the playoffs, all that sort of stuff, there's a lot more second guessing that is to come this offseason. So we'll see if we're sitting here second guessing a lot of these decisions in the coming weeks, in the coming months, or not. But so much of that depends on how this offense performs over the next 6 weeks. So, I'm cautiously optimistic, we'll see what happens. We'll talk more about, the issues involving the defense, as well as, how they can solve some of these issues this offseason on tomorrow's episode. Then later this week, we'll be joined by some guests to get you guys geared up for that Chargers game during this holiday week here in the States for Thanksgiving. We'll probably still do 5 shows a week this week, but we'll see if I have to make adjustments to that. But continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen so you can stay tuned for that. Get the lowdown on this defense on tomorrow's episode. And make sure you check out Locked On NFL to get the lowdown on all the things that happened in this stress-free Sunday, where the Falcons did not stress you out on this particular Sunday. But, maybe you got stressed out by watching some of these other games this Sunday, and get the lowdown on those by checking out Locked On NFL. You can find it on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.